Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Dodge City Days 2025 Salute the Troops. Please stand and remove cover as we present the colors. Ladies and gentlemen, please join us in the singing of our national anthem, followed by the Kansas State song, Home on the Range, accompanied by the Dodge City Cowboy Band.
and that I will obey the orders of the President of the United States and the orders of the officers appointed over me, according to regulations and the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So help me God. Ladies and gentlemen, standing before you are the few soldiers and Marines of the United States Army and Marine Corps.
How about that, ladies and gentlemen? One more round of applause. So welcome to tonight's Salute the Troops. We'd like to thank Freddy's Frozen Custard and Steak Burgers along with Pepsi Cola for tonight's event and food. Tonight, we'll celebrate America and the Old West with music from our own Dodge City Cowboy Band. So let's get this concert started. In early 1943, the newly built Dodge City Army Airfield was designated an Army Air Force's pilot school and was one of 3 B-26 Marauder training bases. It served in this capacity throughout World War II until 1945 when it was deactivated. The site served as the Dodge City Airport until the late 1950s. Next up, we salute this military history with a march entitled Military Escort, composed by Henry Fillmore using his pseudonym Harold Bennett. Military Escort is generally regarded as one of the very best easy marches ever written. John Philip Sousa was reported to have told Fillmore, "Well, I wish that march had my name on it." Here is Military Escort. to the Old West. And this next tune by the band salutes that wonderful heritage. This piece features 3 gallant tunes from great Western movies. The first one, The Magnificent Seven, where 7 title characters are hired to protect a small Mexican village from marauding bandits. How the West Was Won, one of Hollywood's greatest epics depicting the West as it was when won by pioneers, settlers, and adventurers. And Silverado, where 4 men bring peace and equality to the city of Silverado. Here is the Wild Westerns. In 1959, the musical Gypsy opened on Broadway, based on the memoirs of Gypsy Rose Lee, It follows the dreams and efforts of Mama Rose to raise two daughters to perform on stage and casts an affectionate eye on the hardships of show business life. Tonight, the band will present the showstopper tune, Everything's Cutting Up Roses from Gypsy. But there is a second reason for playing this tune tonight, because it was 50 years ago this summer that the Pride of Southwest Kansas began fundraising to send the band to Pasadena, California for the 1976 Tournament of Roses Parade. This tune was played a lot by the band that summer and fall as they prepared for the trip of a lifetime. We do have two members of the Pride who were part of that trip here tonight, our tenor saxes Doug Austin and Lori Piper Kepley. This trip to the Rose Parade was the second time the Pride of Southwest Kansas appeared in Pasadena. The very first time was in 1961. Here's the Cowboy Band with Everything's Coming Up Roses. Was a bandmaster and composer of classic marches. At the age of 19, he began playing baritone in various circus bands. His first full-time conducting job was in 1914 with the combined Sells Floto Circus and Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show. He eventually became bandmaster of the Barnum and Bailey Circus Band in 1917. In 1920, he became the conductor for the Fort Dodge Municipal Band, a position he held for 51 years. The next march from the Cowboy Band is entitled Rough Riders, and paid tribute to both President Theodore Roosevelt and the volunteer cavalrymen who became known as the Rough Riders. Here is a great gallop march, Rough Riders. You know, we're just a couple of blocks from the original Santa Fe Trail. Originating in Independence, Missouri and connecting with Santa Fe, New Mexico, the trail served for nearly 60 years as a vital commercial highway. The various sections of this next piece include Cimarron Cutoff, Mountain Vistas, Buffalo Bill, and Pikes Peak. Ladies and gentlemen, the Dodge City Cowboy Band with Along the Santa Fe Trail. In 2007, PBS premiered a 7-part miniseries directed by Ken Burns through the lenses of 4 quintessential American towns: Laverne, Minnesota; Mobile, Alabama; Sacramento, California; and Waterbury, Connecticut. It recounted the experiences of a number of individuals from these communities as they moved through the war in the Pacific, African, and European theaters. American Anthem, written by Gene Shear, was theme music for that documentary. It was originally premiered in 1999 at the Smithsonian Institution's unveiling ceremony for the restored original Star Spangled Banner flag. Here is American Anthem. Sousa once said, "A march should make a man with a wooden leg step out." And Henry Fillmore's America Exultant is exactly the kind of march that he had in mind. The march features the trombones throughout, a trumpet, and drum motif, and finishes with a trio based on America. Here is Henry Fillmore's America Exultant. The band's next piece is a wonderful overture written with gorgeous melodies and harmonies that create a Wild West atmosphere. Red Rock Canyon by Robert Sheldon was written to capture the beautiful terrain near Las Vegas, Nevada. The different sections of this overture paint a picture of what it is like to hike among the massive boulders and rocky trails in broad daylight, or even enjoy the mesmerizing change of colors at sunset on the uniquely colored landscape. Here is Red Rock Canyon. The next number from the band will pay tribute to all of our men and women in uniform. It will give us a chance to salute all you veterans who are here today as well. This melody of tunes salutes the Army, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines. As you hear your branch of services song played, we invite you to proudly stand. And everyone, sing out proudly if you know the words. To our veterans and our active duty personnel, we humbly thank you with Armed Forces Salute. No patriotic concert would be complete without this next piece. Sousa wrote this march on Christmas Day, 1896, while traveling home from Europe on an ocean liner, and had just heard of the recent death of David Blakely, the manager of the Sousa Band. He composed the march in his head and put it to paper when he arrived in the United States. It was first performed on May 1st, 1897 in Augusta, Maine. Ladies and gentlemen, the Dodge City Cowboy Band with John Philip Sousa's masterpiece, Stars and Stripes Forever. How about that Cowboy band? Thank you so much for joining us tonight for Salute the Troops, and you'll have one more opportunity to hear the band as they lead the Longhorn Cattle Drive on Saturday. And look for them again in December for their annual Christmas concert at Village Square Mall. Have a good night, everyone.